I was seated in the third row, right behind the bride's aunt and 2 seats over from the man who used to coach his Little League team. The ceremony had been beautiful, elegant, intimate, choreographed down to the last candle flicker. I watched him, my son, standing tall in a suit I helped him pick months ago, saying his vows with a trembling voice and glistening eyes. I held mine back. I had held a lot back over the years. The speech came after the cake, just before the dancing. He took the mic with both hands and cleared his throat, looking around the room with a nervous smile. "I wouldn't be here without the people in this room," he began. I leaned forward slightly, heart, doing that foolish thing hope makes it do, to my mentor who showed me how to lead. To my in-laws for welcoming me like a son. To my friends for standing by me when I was lost. And to my dad, even from afar, you shaped me. I waited. One more sentence, just one, but it never came. He handed the mic back to the DJ as applause filled the hall. People turned to each other smiling, nodding, and I just sat there, quiet. Still not crying, not yet, but holding something sharp in my chest. I had raised him alone, paid for every book, every broken bone, every desperate dream, and in front of everyone on the biggest day of his life, he thanked everyone. Everyone but me. And that's when I realized I wasn't in his story anymore. At least, not the version he told out loud. I didn't leave. I didn't cause a scene. I stayed seated with my hands folded in my lap, the linen napkins still resting across my knees like I hadn't just been erased. People around me clapped and stood, some wiping their eyes, others raising glasses. I clapped too quietly, politely because I knew how to disappear without walking away. It's a skill you learn as a mother, especially when you've been the only one. You learn how to step back so they can step forward, how to hold applause in your chest while they're praised for things you sacrificed to make possible. One woman leaned over and whispered, "You must be so proud." I smiled and nodded. Proud, of course. He looked happy, he looked loved, but pride can't breathe through pain, not when it's fresh, not when it's public. I thought about every night I stayed up waiting for him to come home safe. Every shift I worked when he needed shoes. Every parent-teacher meeting I went to alone. I thought about the birthdays I planned, the meals I skipped, the dreams I folded to fit his. And still he looked at that room and forgot me. Not by accident, by habit. Because I had never asked for credit. I had just done the work. And now, watching him laugh with his new family, I felt like a relic of a life he'd outgrown. Not a mother, not even a guest of honor, just a placeholder in the crowd. And somehow, that silence stung more than any loud betrayal could have. Dinner was served not long after. I picked at the food on my plate, chewing slowly, pretending to listen to conversations around me. People spoke about the venue, the floral arrangements, how beautiful the vows were. No one mentioned his speech. No one noticed what was missing except me, and maybe that was the hardest part. The erasure wasn't just his, it was collective. Everyone accepted it as complete, as if nothing had been overlooked. I had raised him through storms, through loneliness, through bills that arrived like clockwork and help that never did. I had played every role, nurse, teacher, coach, cheerleader, and still, when the lights were brightest, I was invisible. He passed by my table once, arm in arm with his bride. He smiled at me, said, "You okay, Mom?" Like I was just another guest. Like my heart hadn't cracked 2 feet from the open bar. I nodded. Of course I nodded, because what was I going to say? Actually, I'm drowning in silence you created. No, that wasn't the place. And he didn't have time to hear it. He was pulled into the next photo, the next toast, the next chapter. I watched him go, and something inside me settled. Not in peace, but in clarity. This wasn't an oversight. It was a pattern. I had built a life that made it easy to overlook me. I had taught him that I would always be there, quietly in the background. And now, in front of everyone, he'd honored that lesson perfectly by leaving me out. The next morning I woke up before the sun. Old habit, I've always started my day's early laundry bills, planning, making sure there was food on the table and shoes that fit. But that morning I just sat. I didn't make coffee. I didn't open the curtains. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of the previous night settle in. There's a particular ache that comes from being forgotten in a room you helped build. And this wasn't about needing public recognition. It was about realizing that I had been edited out of a moment I'd spent a lifetime preparing him for. I thought about the first time he fell off his bike, how he cried and reached for me without hesitation. I remembered the day he got into college, how he collapsed into my arms, overwhelmed and proud. I remembered all the in-betweens, the scraped knees, the midnight fevers, the slammed doors, the whispered apologies, and all of it was held by me, alone. And yet, in that glittering ballroom filled with candles and praise, there hadn't been space for that version of history, only the polished one. The one where others arrived when things were already standing. I realized then that grief doesn't always come from death. Sometimes it comes from watching someone walk away from the version of you that made them. And I wasn't just grieving my place in his speech. I was grieving the version of us that once needed each other. The version he buried in favor of applause. I got dressed anyway. Habit again. Composure stitched into every movement. I made breakfast even though I wasn't hungry. I cleaned the kitchen counters even though they were already clean. When you spend your life giving, motion becomes your comfort. Stillness feels like guilt. But that day, as I wiped down the same surface twice, I realized how much of my life had been maintenance of his world, of his emotions, of his potential. I had kept everything running so smoothly that maybe he never even noticed the effort. Maybe that was the problem. I had raised him not to need me, and in doing so, I'd made myself invisible. I never asked to be celebrated. I just didn't expect to be discarded. And that was the word I couldn't shake, discarded. Like a coat left at the door of a party. Necessary in the cold but inconvenient once things warmed up. I opened a drawer and found a photo of Usim as a boy, face full of crumbs and joy, sitting in my lap with his arms around my neck. I remembered how tightly he used to cling to me, how afraid he was of the dark, how he once cried when I left him at kindergarten. Where had that boy gone, and who had I become in the meantime? I wasn't bitter, not yet, but I was bruised. And bruises don't scream. They throb quietly under the skin, reminding you where it hurt. I folded the photo back into the drawer and whispered to the silence, I was there. Even if no one says it, I was there. I spent the afternoon walking through our neighborhood. The same streets I used to push his stroller through, the same sidewalks where he first learned to ride his bike while I ran behind him, breathless but proud. Everything looked the same, but I didn't. I was older now, quieter, a little more hollow than I wanted to admit. I passed by the school he used to attend and could still hear the echo of his laugh when he'd run toward me at pickup. Back then, he always looked for me first. Back then, I was his whole world. Somewhere along the way, that world got bigger and I got smaller inside it. I had celebrated that once, called it growth, independence, success. But watching him thank the world and leave me behind made me question whether I had confused growing apart with being left behind. I sat on a bench beneath a tree we once picnicked under and asked myself something I hadn't dared to ask before. Had I raised a good man or just a grateful stranger? It's a dangerous thought, that one, because it turns your love into a mirror you're afraid to look into. I wasn't expecting perfection. I wasn't even expecting public praise, but a single sentence, thank you, Mom, would have been enough to say, I see you. And he hadn't, not even once. That kind of absence leaves a shadow. One you can't escape by walking it off. I looked up at the tree's branches and thought, maybe it's time to stop watering something that no longer grows toward you. A few days later, I received a photo album in the mail. No note, no return address, just a padded envelope with my name on it, and his handwriting, mistakable, neat, careful, like always. I opened it cautiously, unsure if this was meant as peace, or just an afterthought. Inside were pictures from the wedding, the venue bathed in golden light, the first dance, group photos with friends and family, page after page of polished moments. I flipped through them slowly, pausing whenever I saw myself in the corner of a frame, always slightly out of focus, always off to the side. There I was, adjusting a tablecloth before the reception, standing near the doorway while guests took selfies, holding my purse tightly in my lap during the toasts. I wasn't invisible, I was peripheral, present but unacknowledged, and somehow that hurt more than being left out entirely. I reached the end of the album and found a single photo. Tucked behind the back cover, it was older. Worn, a picture of us from years ago, just him and me on his graduation day. I had my arm around him and he was smiling wide, eyes full of youth and hope. On the back, in small blue ink, he had written, for everything before. The spotlight, that was it. No apology, no explanation, just that one line. I sat with it for a while, unsure what to feel. Gratitude, sadness, both. Because the truth is, some gestures don't fix the wound, they just show you it was real. And that's what that picture did. It reminded me I hadn't imagined the silence. I had survived it. That night, I placed the album on the shelf beside a stack of books he used to read as a child, stories we shared at bedtime. His head resting on my shoulder, his small fingers turning the pages. Those were the chapters of our life no one else had seen. No photographers, no applause, no filtered edits. Just us, in the quiet intimacy of survival and routine. I stood in the hallway afterward, staring at a blank patch of wall, wondering why it had taken me so long to create space for myself beyond him. I had made my identity so tightly woven with his growth that I had forgotten to grow on my own. His success had become my validation, his happiness my purpose. And in that kind of love, it's easy to disappear. The truth hit me quietly. I had raised a man strong enough to stand without me and blind enough not to look back. But I had also raised myself to believe that was enough. Maybe that was the mistake. I walked into the kitchen and brewed tea, not out of habit this time, but as a small kindness to myself. As the water boiled, I whispered what I needed to hear, even if no one else would say it. You did well. You mattered, even if no one clapped. I poured the tea, sat by the window, and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Just sadness, but relief. Because now, I knew where I stood. Not in the spotlight. Not in his speech. But in the quiet place where love had once been planted and where, finally, I was learning to bloom on my own. The next morning, I did something small but significant. I opened a blank notebook and wrote my name at the top of the first page. Not his, not ours, just mine. I had spent decades keeping records of his milestones, first steps, report cards, birthdays, goals, but I had never once documented my own as if my life had only been valuable through the lens of his. I began writing not a letter to him, not a list of grievances, but memories that belonged to me alone. The way I used to hum when folding laundry, the silent prayer I'd whisper before each of his exams, the meals I cooked with whatever we had, making magic from near-empty cupboards. I wrote about the strength it took to smile when I was exhausted, about the joy I felt watching him sleep after a hard day, about how deeply I loved him even when he forgot. Each word felt like stitching myself back together. Not to be seen, but to remember. I realized I had waited too long for others to name my role, to validate my sacrifice, to tell me I belonged. But maybe real motherhood isn't about being remembered. Maybe it's about choosing to remember yourself, even when no one else does. I looked at that first page, the one that finally had my name on it, and for once, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt whole, and it occurred to me that perhaps the final chapter of raising a child is learning to stop disappearing in their story and start writing your own. A few weeks later, I received a formal invitation to a post-wedding brunch they were hosting for close family. The envelope was elegant, embossed, addressed in calligraphy, but it didn't stir anything in me. Once I would have felt honored. Once I would have gone early to help set the tables, brought extra napkins, remembered everyone's dietary restrictions. But this time, I simply placed it on the counter and walked away. I wasn't angry, I was just done showing up to be overlooked. The invitation said close family, and now I understood what that meant. Proximity, not history. Appearances, not depth. I decided not to attend. Instead, I spent that Sunday morning at the small cafe near the park, the one he used to love when he was little, where we'd go for hot chocolate and laughter after long school days. I brought my notebook with me and sat near the window, watching families pass by, hearing the soft clink of mugs and conversation. For the first time, in a long time, I felt like I was in my own company, not waiting for someone to see me, not hoping for inclusion. I was already whole. I opened the notebook and added more to my story. Not about him this time, about me. About the books I still wanted to read, the places I might visit. The parts of myself I had buried beneath mom that were beginning to reach sunlight again. I didn't need a brunch to prove I belonged. I had already fed, clothed, and protected a life into becoming. That's closer than any invitation would ever come. Later that afternoon, I received a message from him. Short, casual, didn't see you today. Everything okay? I stared at the screen for a long moment. So that was it. No phone call. Number. Knock on my door? Just a sentence that sounded more like an obligation than a concern. I thought about ignoring it. I thought about writing a long response, one that listed every moment he'd overlooked, every thank you he never gave. But I didn't want to bleed to be understood. I had already done enough of that in silence, so I simply replied, everything is okay. I just chose to spend the day with someone who remembers everything I've done. He didn't reply. Not right away. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Maybe he did, but didn't want to face it. I didn't wait. I closed the message, set down my phone, and took a sip of coffee. Across the cafe, a mother was wiping her toddler's mouth, her own shirt stained with juice and crumbs. I smiled gently. That used to be me, and I knew in her eyes she thought she was invisible too. But I wanted to tell her one day, you'll learn your value isn't in their memory, it's in your own. That night, I walked home with no sadness in my chest, just air, breath, freedom. There is power in not being missed. It means you're no longer chained to expectation. You're finally free to define your worth without waiting for them to remember. And in that space, something new begins. A few days later, a small package arrived at my door. No note, just a plain brown box with my name printed clearly. Inside was a framed photo from the wedding one I hadn't seen. It was of me, standing alone near the edge of the reception hall, watching him dance with his new wife. The lighting caught my face just right, soft and still, my expression unreadable. Someone must have taken it candidly. On the back, in that same familiar handwriting, just 5 words. I know you were there. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't public. It didn't undo the silence, the speech, the crowd that clapped without knowing what had been left unsaid. But it was something, a breadcrumb, a fragment of acknowledgement that, for a moment, pulled the past and present into the same frame. I placed the photo on my shelf not because I needed proof, but because I deserved to choose what stayed. I didn't call him. I didn't send a thank you. Some gestures don't need to be completed, they just need to exist. I looked at the image one more time and realized he had seen me, maybe too late. Maybe without the courage to say it out loud, but he had seen me, and that meant I could stop trying to be seen. I could finally live beyond his line of sight. Because I was no longer standing at the edge of his life, I was walking back to the center of mine. On the first quiet Sunday that followed, I did something I hadn't done in years. I packed a small bag and left town for the weekend. No itinerary. No one to inform, no reason to justify it. Just me, a weathered notebook and a map with circles. Around places I had once wanted to visit but always postponed. For field trips, for fevers, for rent, for him. The drive was long and peaceful, the kind where silence doesn't hurt, it heals. I stopped at a lakeside inn, the kind with creaky floors and soft lamps, and a porch swing overlooking the water. That evening, I sat outside, wrapped in a blanket, and watched the sun melt into the water. A golden line dividing what was and what could still be. I opened my notebook again. The first page still had my name. The rest now carried something different. Not just memory, but possibility. I wrote down things I wanted to try. Meals I wanted to cook just for myself. Books I wanted to read aloud. With no one listening, I was building a new language. One that didn't begin and end with being mom. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't abandonment. It was return. A quiet reunion with the woman I had tucked away to raise a life, and now, that life had walked its path. I had done my part. With or without the thank you, I had made something from nothing, and now, finally, I could begin again with space, with grace, with a name that didn't require applause to be worthy. The next morning, I woke early and walked along the water's edge, my footsteps quiet in the damp sand. No messages, no responsibilities, no one needing anything from me. For the first time in years, I felt like a whole person, not a role, not a title, not a background figure in someone else's story. Just a woman with a past. She survived and a future she was finally allowed to imagine. I thought of him, of course. I always would. That's the unspoken truth about motherhood. It doesn't vanish with distance. But the ache wasn't as sharp. Now, it had softened into something I could carry without it breaking me. I stopped by a small cafe on the corner and ordered tea. The woman behind the counter smiled and asked if I wanted it for here or to go. For here, I said, surprised by my own answer. I sat by the window, sipping slowly, savoring the time that belonged only to me. There was no rush, no countdown to the next responsibility, just light pouring in through the glass and the soft murmur of strangers living lives that didn't revolve around me, and for once, that felt like peace, not loneliness. I didn't need to be someone's mother in that moment. I didn't need to be needed. I was just me, and I was enough. I opened my notebook again, this time writing not about what I had lost, but about what I was beginning to find. A voice, a rhythm. A woman who remembered her own name, even when the world had once clapped around her and forgotten to speak it. That night, back in my room, I lit a small candle by the bedside and watched its flame flicker quietly like breath. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt true. For the first time in a long time, I didn't measure myself against anyone's expectations. Not his, not society's, not even my own past image of what a good mother should be. I had been good. I had been more than good. And whether or not the world ever said it, I had written ITN lunchbox notes, on job applications filled out late at night, on walls held together by resilience and love no one ever saw. I placed the wedding photo back into my bag not out of bitterness, but because even silence has a place in our story. I wasn't ashamed of loving him. I wasn't ashamed of hoping, but I no longer needed that hope to look like a spotlight. It could be a quiet path forward, just for me. Tomorrow I'd head home, back to my kitchen, my window, my life. But something would be different now, not in the house but in the woman who walked into it. She would no longer wait to be thanked. She would no longer confuse sacrifice with disappearance. She had survived invisibility and chosen instead to become visible to herself. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting the ones who forgot you, but remembering the one who stayed when no one else did. Have you ever been left out of a moment you helped create to realize you were the foundation all along?